Hi, welcome to another Fine Points with our great panel here today. Bruce, of course, who Fine Points is named after, and Ryan and Dennis. Thought we had a really great conversation last week. Dennis was, I think, really an amazing addition to the panel, and glad he could join us this week again. So I'm going to start off by taking just a few minutes to read something, and then we'll begin the conversation. What I want to read is a document. A few hundred years ago, there were these guys. There was this guy named Thomas Jefferson who wrote this document called the Declaration of Independence, and then several years later, this other guy, James Madison, was the principal author of the Constitution. The two of them agreed on many things, and one of the things they agreed upon is that one of the most important documents every American should read, and I guess Americans want to make America great, and part of being great is reading the documents by the people who made America to begin with, okay? And so this is a document written by a guy, a former president. He also was a general. Some people might have heard of him. His name is George Washington. I hope most of you have heard of him. And he gave a farewell address, and both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said, this is one of the most important documents every American should read and reread and reread again, okay? So I'm not going to read the whole document, but I'm going to just read a section of the document. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. Remember that word, liberty, okay? This, within certain limits, is probably true, and in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose. And there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one, and thus to create whatever form of government a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us to the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the excess of political power by dividing it and distributing it into different depositaries and constituting each the guardians of the public weal against invasions by the others has been evinced by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our own country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this, in one instant, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. So what's the message here? Bruce, why don't you
Yeah.
because you're very familiar with this document. Why don't you explain in modern language what George Washington meant when he said this? Okay,
Yeah.
what was the point of this paragraph that I read?
Yes. Well, what he meant was that insofar as we find any alleged deficiencies in the Constitution, the alteration should come through the amendment process, not by usurpations, claiming you've got logjam or gridlock and therefore you flout the rule of law. The amendment process, of course, was used in the very first Congress to give us the Bill of Rights, and has been used on 27 other occasions. And he was also arguing against succumbing to partisanship as opposed to the Constitution itself as the chief loyalty of anyone who served in public office. And recognizing as well, given the tendency of the human heart for ambition and power, that checks and balances was necessary everywhere. And no department, judicial, legislative, or executive, could be entrusted with infinite power. That is a lesson, unfortunately, that we have completely lost. And that's why when you hear arguments today, not for the first time, that elections, that presidents have mandates, and therefore the Constitution should not stand in the way, it's totally contrary to understanding the nature of the Constitution, which is to place limits on popular government unless popular government is able to assemble the majorities needed to amend the Constitution, which they're entitled to do. That happened after the Civil War with the Civil War amendments. But that's the legal process you do it. A president cannot run on a campaign saying, I'm going to violate these provisions of the Constitution if you give me an electoral mandate. That's not how it works. You go through 2/3 of the House and the Senate, you go through 3/4 of state legislatures, and you can have the amendment process.
As long as it's with not repugnant to the Constitution, as we often bring up.
Yes. And also, I mean, I don't remember whether you were there, Dennis, but you remember the 18-year-old voting rights amendment that was ratified in like 13 weeks. Under the consensus, we shouldn't be sending 18-year-olds to die in swamps in Vietnam, and they can't even vote. So the amendment process can work fastly. It can be very slow as well. But the process is what's key. We have a consensus on that sort. But I do believe that the key element in Washington's address was you have to maintain separation of powers. No one branch can exercise dominating influence of another. And we're seeing that happen virtually every single day, and including as we speak right now.
Now, what's the linkage? And then I'll turn it over to everyone else. Why did I start up with this? And what's the linkage to the topic of conversation is how, if yes, how should the First Amendment be bounded? At what speech should be considered illegal speech? And why did I link this? Because I linked it to Washington's comments is because basically what George Washington warned us is that too much partisanship would result likely in political violence. So, and if you see the comments that we're seeing by many people, we have almost everybody universally condemning the tragic death of Charlie Kirk. As almost as every death that's not natural is a tragic death. So, every human being has the same value, and no human being should suffer death other than let nature take its course. So anything other than that is an abomination and a tragedy, equally so. But here, we had, what did we have Trump say? We had Trump say basically is that the reason why there's a radical right is because of the radical left. And I'm sure if you ask people from the radical left, they say there's a radical left because there's a radical right. So basically, it's what has radicalized people is partisanship. And when we take a look at brain right now, is we're now looking at almost all the languages. Miller comes out and says, this is a domestic terrorist movement. Okay, so basically now who falls under this description of being part of this domestic terrorist movement? Well, I guess if you criticize Israel, you might be part of the domestic terrorist movement. Okay, if you don't canonize Charlie Kirk, you might say terrible tragedy, and then somebody said, what do you think of his views? You say, I didn't share his views, but it's still a tragedy that he died and his life should have never been taken the way it was taken. But I'm not going to canonize him, if I disagreed with his views. So, but essentially what we have right now is we have a process where, the same people we had a Fox host, I think 2 days ago, suggest that we should exterminate every homeless person. Okay, there was not much outrage about the suggestion that we should exterminate every homeless person. Okay, so what if people went out there and started shooting homeless people and said, I saw this Fox analyst say this is what we should do, and I started doing it, and then I say I'm going to blame this Fox person, for my action, and we had this president. Okay, didn't he pardon people who were saying hang Mike Pence? So the point is, many people who think maybe hanging Mike Pence was justified, but shooting Charlie Kirk is not justified. And this type of thinking is a consequence of partisanship. So
I can jump in.
So that's why I wanted to start off with Washington basically telling us in a free society based upon a popular form of government, where there's an elective form of government, the worst thing we want to have happen, the threat to liberty, is partisan politics. So that's why I linked what George Washington had to say with the topic we're having here. So now I'll open up. Ryan, what would you like to say?
Well, just on the opening conversation, there's so many ways we're going to get into this important conversation today, but really starting with your point, I really found that, an important thing to tie back to like the foundational ideas of this country. And I'm glad you tied it to today, because we're watching these things get completely undermined in real time. But so to the point about partisanship, but also the idea of, all the different ways we're seeing us like pitted against each other. I really found that statement, the customary weapon of, of which free government is destroyed. And you can see how long we've been warned about this exact thing. And it's just it's exactly right, because they're using these things to do that now from the power structures. Like they know that's how this is used. But I wanted to point out from, like you said, partisan is the problem, right? But that's government, in my opinion. It's not necessarily the ideas of partisanship, but I see that as government utilizing partisan sides to divide, not necessarily that having a partisan mindset is necessarily bad. It's about that being exploited by power structures. And I think the important conversation today, like you said, is going to be very much around the First Amendment. And I'm excited to talk about, and I'm sure we'll have different opinions on this, where that line really stands today. And I'm sure people know to watch my work that I'm very much leaning to the principle. Even in the face of things like fire in a theater, like I think we need to go back to the principle, regardless of the worry that may come around it, and justified worry. I get it. Like I can understand why those things are in place, or why somebody might argue somebody calling for violence should be treated like a crime. And as much as I understand that, I feel like I'm leaning hard the other direction because of how easily that is to be abused, and that crimes are crimes, the words are words. And I think we can get into all of this, but I wanted to really emphasize off Bruce's point, and I'll pass to Dennis, the idea of the Bill of Rights. And we talked about this so much, but it's such a great time to reiterate this point with how you laid that out, is that many Americans have been convinced that governments give you rights and that they can take them away based on emergencies, based on anything. And even whether we believe that or not, there's legal structures that have created that opening for emergencies, for example. I don't think that's justified. I think it's unconstitutional. The Bill of Rights were amendments to the Constitution, and the reality of why they're standing is because they were not repugnant to the original Constitution. And that's Mayberry versus Madison. We've talked about it more than once. And Bruce, if there's other citations, please bring them up, because that's the one that I know of. And the point being is that those were not repugnant. So they didn't challenge the original ideas. So for example, today, if they came out with a law that said you can't own a gun, and everyone voted for it, it shouldn't stand because of that ruling and the Supreme Court and the understanding of the Constitution, because it's repugnant to the Constitution. Those first 10 were not. Very important to think about going forward. So I'll leave it there. And
I would just add, to reinforce Washington's sentiments, they found expression in Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, where he said, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. Every difference of opinion is not a difference in principle. And that let different opinions stand as a testament to the freedom that we understand that truth can engage with falsehood. And he also said that the majority needs to recognize that the minority has rights that the majority has to respect, with regard to tolerating, different views. And we did have, for almost 20 years, an era what was called the era of good feelings, where the party systems virtually didn't exist from Jefferson to Madison to James Monroe. Then they reemerged with Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. But we had that very long period when the people we're talking about now, Madison and Jefferson, were then in the presidency, Secretary of State, and were the leaders of the country. They were not engaged in partisanship, and said we didn't even have a party system for that period of time. We should go back to that era of good feelings. It really was quite a marvelous expression of the ideas that Washington explained in the farewell address against partisanship.
Because at that point, we can just hold the government accountable as one thing, as opposed to playing this off each other back and forth situation, which is what I often point out. If we can just collectively acknowledge and engage with them as a structure, and if we don't like what's going on, we can engage with them in that one way. So I'll pass to Dennis. So I just think that's all. If we can look at it as one thing, I think that's the best way to do this today.
Yeah, when I would ask Dennis, can you explain to our audience, when you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, psychologically, did you understand that was superior to any loyalty you had to a political party, that there was a conflict, the party had to be subservient to your constitutional oath?
100%. It is what it says. Take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, not to defend a political party. I'd like to go back to the beginning of the discussion and bring it forward to this point, building on what each of you have said. And let's go back to Jeffrey's comment about the language that of the 18th century and the philosophical underpinnings of that language. I think what we're seeing here is a reflection of a decline in the philosophical underpinnings of our country. The thoughts that gave rise to the Declaration and later to the Constitution came as a result of deeply held philosophies that went back and preceded hundreds of years before that. And it's almost as if we've had a break in the intellectual evolution of democratic or republican thinking, and that in effect what we have here is a decline of language, which represents a decline of the consciousness that produced this government, and which represents a disconnection from any deep philosophy or thinking about how to establish a working polity. It's almost a philosophical anarchism. We're seeing a decoupling of thought, word, and deed when they're actually unitary. We had the last week's discussion was about the unitary executive. Well, this discussion could also include the fact that thoughts, consciousness are real. Words have impact and precede deeds and are deeds in themselves. The disconnect between all this and language and thought and communication has led us to a point of a twisted mass consciousness. We all of our moorings are being ripped away, and in this cycling morass of partisanship and polarity and dichotomization that can only lead to a devolution of the very principles which this discussion started off examining, those principles that were foundational. They're now trapped in a in the washing machine of social media, the agitation back and forth until things don't make any sense at all. And all we have is splenetic, nothing from the head, nothing from the heart. It's a dangerous moment for sure.
And to piggyback on that too, just to make to what you were saying, I find interesting is, it's common to use anarchism as kind of synonymous with chaos, but the word doesn't mean that technically. And so the idea of, I think it's important to kind of reflect on how, like you're saying, words and the meaning and how these things can be used against us. For example, like, anarchism means no rulers, not no rules. And it tends to be conflated with that. I simply think it's a side point. It's because power structures recognize that it's the only ideology that has no place for rulers. But I think in a larger point, I think it's important to recognize that, we are talking about things to relay message. Our words are meant to relay our thoughts and our ideas. And if people are listening to those words and the definitions are different in their mind, like, we're cutting into something much, it's like a very different conversation to understand how we even relaying these ideas and discussing these and finding common ground if we can't even agree on the basic understanding of words. And this is something that government is doing everywhere we look. And this comes back to the very idea, like, this is the same kind of conversation of free speech and suppression and sort of driving us into like this collective mindset, this tunnel vision of ideas that they're driving us forward with, because we're afraid to challenge these things. We're afraid to, get censored. It's just everywhere we look. And so I think that's why this is, along with the constitutionality of with the immigration conversation and arrests and things like that, this is a paramount conversation for where we are in this country.
And you can't have the rule of law unless you have some kind of common understanding of what words mean.
Right.
So, for example, we all had an understanding until Trump what emergency was, imminent danger to the extinguishment of the country. He uses emergency to describe anything that he doesn't like. We have an energy emergency with unarmed men and women over the border, emergency with Venezuela attacking the United States, emergency with tariffs, emergency with the budget. Anything's an emergency. And then he exercises all these extraordinary powers that are outside the rule of law. So words don't mean anything anymore to this administration. I mean, the idea you asked, an ordinary American, is in Venezuela at war and attacking the United States, they'd think it belonged in a mental institution. And yet this is the standard that the administration walks into federal courts and tells them that's going to happen. And they're not even embarrassed by that.
Yeah.
The other
Bruce, on that point, Bruce, I'm just going to leave it on that point because you mentioned Venezuela. Yeah. I don't know if you read over the weekend, there was another interdiction of a fishing boat. Yeah. Because they fishing boat supposedly was not really a fishing boat, but it was a boat to bring a whole bunch of drugs over to the United States to kill all Americans. And when they got on the boat, on their reliable information, okay, what did they find? That it was a fishing boat. Okay. So if they interdicted on this boat, supposedly with the reliable information that this was not really a fishing boat, the other boat that they blew out of the water, okay, with supposedly the group of drug dealers who they can't name who they are and demonstrate that they were members of Trendragua. They've never presented that. How frequently has now this administration made statements in public, then when they've gone to a court and they've been told that have to make these statements under oath, that they've backed away from the statements that they've made publicly? I mean, we've done it so frequently that nobody should believe anything they have to say.
Yeah. But Jeffrey, it goes beyond that. Jeffrey, the explanation that the administration came up with for killing the 11 was it was self-defense for the drug users who might buy the drugs and then die of an overdose many years down the road. Right. Now, could you imagine that'd be laughed out of court? Your defense counsel? Are you kidding me? An absurd assertion. Then we have followed, because this is clearly serial lying, that the administration first said there were 800 U.S. citizen children in the United States whose parents wanted them to join them in Guatemala or Honduras, El Salvador. Anyway, it was a big lie. The parents all stated, no, we want our children who are U.S. citizens to remain there. And the administration goes into the corner. Well, I guess we lied. We couldn't get that one past you. The Pinocchio nose grew too fast. But we're now in a situation where the government, and we can understand there can be individual isolated instances where an error can be made. But this is systemic.
Right.
Lie after lie after lie after lie. And this makes it very hard to have a rule of law, because you have to have some at least limited range of meaning that you can attach to a word. Otherwise, you just say a word means the opposite. It's a homonym, sounds the same, but now we're treating it differently. And the rule of law is out the window.
But we now have a president who says that the only dictionary exists is him and how he defines words. So, I mean, let's give example of another case that's now fresh. Lisa Cook, the Fed member. So it seems now that there has been evidence is that at the place where she got the loan, she did say it was a second home. She did say that it was rental income, and she accurately seems to have reported on her tax returns. So there seems to be a contradiction between what the documentation she did specifically with the lending and the documents that were produced. That I'm not saying they were forged documents, but I'm just saying there's a contradiction that Pulte, produced, that they're now, investigating to see whether she committed, criminal fraud or not. And with the production of these documents, most of the legal opinions I've read have said it's not likely she committed criminal fraud. So at first Trump said she's a fraudster, so I got to remove her from the Fed. She's a fraudster. Okay. So now he understands that's a weaker argument because his document comes out and maybe it seems more likely she's not a fraudster. And given the fact that it seems more evident that she's not a fraudster with this new information revelations. And the truth is they all should have kept their mouths shut until this was there was sufficient due diligence, but of course you have an administration of people that don't believe in due process. They hear what they want to hear and then they don't want to hear anymore. Okay? And they hear what they more. Let me finish. But then what is he saying now? He says now, because I say it's cause, that means I have cause. I don't have to justify it. I just have to say those words. And once I say these words, nobody else, no court, no Congress, no other body has the right to judge my words and what I mean by them, my definition. If I say there's cause, I'm the president. So we have to think, and then Ryan, I'll turn over. If we have to, when people right now, so you have some people sensitive. Oh, don't call Trump an autocrat. He's not really an autocrat. Let me frame it this way. We have a president that says, I set tariffs. Okay, I don't need Congress for setting tariffs. I call anyone who I want an alien enemy, and once I say those words, they're an alien enemy. Okay. I assert that I have the right. I haven't used it. And maybe I haven't used it. Who knows? But I assert the right that given the fact that I am president, I have the right to assassinate people I think deserve assassination. I have that right. I'm not saying he's done it. Okay, and I'm not accusing him of doing it. But in court, he argued that he has immunity for doing those things if he deems it in the national interest to do so. So. And the argument in all these cases is the same thing. Once I make the assertion that there's an emergency, I alone can make that, and nobody else has the right to question my judgment, being the fact that I am the president with all these superpowers. And not only that, I don't even think I have to uphold the Constitution or it applies to me. So if someone says all those things, would that come to be a reasonable matching of a definition of an autocrat is?
Well, let me weigh in here, if I may. And you have to excuse me for keeping this discussion at 40,000 feet, if you will. I've been on the ground for many, many years in government at different levels. Served 16 years in the U.S. House. Served under 3 presidents. Every president, every administration tries to shape the country in their own image. And in doing so, they, mobilize public opinion. sometimes with statements that aren't true. It may be more pronounced now than we're used to, but it does happen and has happened in other administrations. The point I want to make specifically is this. Words are symbolic action, and those words, especially when they're uttered by the President of the United States, help to create a social reality. Doesn't, maybe unmoored from what's actually happening, but they do help to create a social reality. And the government itself, in a society, apart from the media, the government is a powerful generator of cues about how people should view things, what they should see. And of course, when there's lies, that creates a fracturing of the bond between the government and the people. These statements that are made that are not true, demonstrably not true, they actually contribute to cultural divisions. They contribute to the polarization, and they contribute to the condition that we have right now. And this isn't about blaming anyone. It's about being aware of the dynamic of what happens when high-ranking government officials make statements, whatever their party, that there are consequences. That Ibsen wrote about this in, I believe, in Enemy of the People, when he talked about the power of words, how they can be like a needle, they could stick and create pain. And where social media today is such that, paired with anonymity, that there's no accountability, and that's a problem. And so I think we have to understand the dynamic. That's why I bring it up. We have to understand this dynamic, and wherever it exists, be it in public officials, in the media, in other centers of power in a country, we have to examine it and call it for what it is. We're swimming in philosophically and morally polluted waters right now, which in a Orwellian manner make genocide acceptable to some, and ethnic cleansing a form of redevelopment. It is mind-blowing, but we have to understand the dynamic here before we can isolate it as it's in process and be able to challenge people directly as to what they're doing. And in some cases, these people in public life, they may be unaware. Maybe they're aware, but they may be unaware of the long-term effects. I'm not taking anybody off the hook here, but I'm just saying that we've got to start studying this dynamic and how it's penetrated so deeply into our culture and why.
Yeah, I think we need to do more. I think, Dennis, let's and Ryan and Jeffrey, let's go back to Watergate, which was my kind of baptism in Washington. Article 2 of impeaching Richard Nixon was his continuing lies about the Watergate cover-up. You remember Ron Ziegler, all prior statements are, quote, inoperative. That was made an element of impeaching the president of the United States. Constant lying to make the American people think that everything was on the up and up. Nixon had nothing to do with it. It was just John Dean and others. We need to have consequences for people in public life who make lying systematically a tool of a political ambition. These are not, arguable, and these are not cases where, you can argue semantics one way or the other. These are Goebbels-like staggering lies, stupendous proportions that everybody who has any brains at all knows these are not true. Because when you have public officials who believe, like Humpty Dumpty, a word means whatever I want it to mean, how can you hold anybody accountable? They say, well, I didn't mean that word. It meant the opposite to me. And I believe that at least part of the reason why these lies flourish is because the educational system is broken. It's decayed. Critical thinking is out the window. It's not there anymore. And moreover, there's no inner restraint. No one feels any cognitive dissonance out of making flagrant lies. Part of that, I believe, Dennis, you would know better than me because you served up there, is there's no peer pressure to tell the truth anymore. They're all engaged in it one sort of or another. So there's no ostracism. There's no sense of, well, I maybe did something that I shouldn't have done and I'm going to pay for it because no one wanted to talk to me because I made blatant lies as to what transpired. And that's just a matter of personal responsibility and public opinion saying we're not sending people back to office who are going to lie to us. Even if it makes us feel good, we don't want lies. We overcame that during Watergate, but now we're 50 years down the road and the culture is plunged.
So I'm glad that Dennis, I think all of what we're talking about, like Dennis was leaning into, is it all kind of swirls around this same larger conversation, right? And so we've all made excellent points here, but we've yet to really define individually, so it feels like what you're outlining there is that, and I think we all would agree that people who are, especially at higher levels, politicians, positions of power, who are flagrantly lying, there should be culpability, responsibility, there should be accountability. But what are we talking about when we're saying that? Because this is where I think the crux of the conversation is. Are we talking about there should be legal act? So somebody, let's say the president, or let's just say one of us makes a bombastic lie on a social media platform that maybe leads to somebody getting hurt. Are we now talking about somebody should be taking legal action for that? Should they be censored? Should the president be legally held accountable? Or are we talking about somebody suing them because of something like a personal issue or being removed from office because of those lies, not necessarily legally? This is the meat of the conversation I want to get into, because I think this is really central to this. And I think right now it's easy. And I'll start by saying I understand completely the mindset of, again, to the core, like a fire in a theater idea, where I understand why people would argue that has to be set in place because people could abuse it. But I'm at the point now where I think the principle is more important, and I see more so than ever the power structures using that to drive in their almost what we're talking about. Nothing means anything, everything means nothing, nothing means everything, and words are what they want them to be. I think the only answer to that is to go back to the principle of absolute free speech and hold people accountable in society with the ways that we can.
Well, there are measures of accountability. I mean, if a president's lying and there's enough members of Congress who want to vote to impeach, they can do that. I mean,
right.
I offered articles of impeachment, as Bruce, because our relationship goes back to that time when President Bush and Vice President Cheney lied to take us into war against Iraq. Yeah. Now, the Constitution does have remedies for the executive. The remedies for members of the House is they have to go back to their constituents every 2 years and seek approval. And if they get called on it, they could be bounced. We have one member famously who is now in jail, George Santos, and he was essentially accused of lying. He wasn't the only one who's lied, but he's the one who got caught. And then, on the Senate level, look at Senator Menendez. He, didn't tell the truth about his interactions with various foreign interests, and he's paying the consequences as his wife. So, there are remedies, but when you go from the top and you go through the society, there's other remedies. If somebody lies and they damage someone's reputation, it's called defamation. There is recourse, but where the challenge is the lies that were fed on a cultural level that are sinister and that undermine our national unity. They undermine our national purpose. They put us in fear. They keep us off balance. I mean, and these are lies that are folded into the budget of the United States, to our spending, to our priorities, and we all end up being children of these lies. And the importance for truth telling has never been more significant. Remember, Jimmy Carter got elected with a promise saying, "I'll never lie to you." George Washington, the apocryphally, couldn't tell a lie, chopped down the cherry tree. Well, throughout the history of this country, there's been occasionally a vindication of truth, if not in action, at least rhetorically. We're not seeing that now. We're seeing we are in a morass of lies. In particular, nothing illustrates it more perfectly than what's happening in Gaza. Nothing in the world illustrates the degree to which we as a nation have descended into a cult of lies, as you know, and it demonstrated in genocide, ethnic cleansing, starvation of a population. And so this Constitution, which we have, was the Constitution a lie? No, it was built on a fealty, on a sense of commitment to each other and to a real high purpose. Whether or not, we're all human, we have failings, but it really was aimed at lifting up a country and to be that so-called shining city on a hill. Well, we're not there anymore, and we need to find out how we got to where we are and what we can do to climb out of it. And it starts with a massive truth-telling, a period of truth and reconciliation. It's critical for the United States with respect to a number of the historical events that have happened during our lifetime.
Yeah, well, it's surely true that Trump isn't the first one that lied. The weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a huge lie. We have the lies about the Pentagon Papers publication. It would mean the end of any diplomacy. We have the lies about the second torpedo attack at the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We have the lies about Korea being a police action. It's over and over and over again. We have the lies of James K. Polk saying, the British and the French are going to establish a monarchy in Mexico unless we have an attack. But matters of degree do count. But I think my view of the situation is, and let me add another one, the lie that we're all imminently threatened with international terrorism, even though you're more likely to die because a vending machine fell on you than you'd ever be killed by an international terrorist incident, because the military industrial complex is working 24 hours a day to inflate danger so they can suck money out of our coffers to
really quickly,
$1 a year or more. But I want to go back.
Very quick. Political violence is the same thing. Just want to throw that in there. The stats around it they're showing are the same thing. It's so unlikely, and that's being driven today. Sorry, I had to throw that in.
Right. No, but that's quite fine. But I go back. I really think, our pathology entered in the equation when we abandoned liberty as the greatness. There was a very famous then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, July 4th, 1821 address to Congress. The glory of the United States is liberty, the march of the mind, not domination in the march of the foot soldier. And we made a Faustian bargain years ago. Let's be empire. And so if you're an empire, you tell lies all the time. It's built into the empire culture. Rome told lies all the time that if we don't fight XYZ, Carthage, and we don't have all these Gaul and Athens and conquer the world, we'll be destroyed. That's what empires do. They tell lies. And we live in an empire. We just recently had a vote, without it. It was like a $900 billion defense budget, based upon lie after lie after lie that we're going to be taken over, that Iran is going to attack us. Anyway, the threat inflation is inevitable. And until we go back, in my view, and make liberty the earmark of our greatness, the fact that everyone gets to march to their own drummer, they have a fair opportunity to develop their faculties. We want to celebrate, benevolence, kindness, and wisdom, that we don't really care about going to Mars unless somebody wants to do it on their own dime, that respecting every individual as a human being with equal rights, that's the greatness of a country, not all the other stuff, the so-called externalities, whether we have our own form of pyramids or otherwise. And that just doesn't exist today. You can't even have a debate about the stupidity and the violence of empire. You're accused of being unpatriotic, anti-Semitic, or something or other. You can't even get off the ground floor to have a decent discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to further expand, and especially on Bruce's comment. I mean, Dennis's comment. Sorry, given also that Dennis has a hard stop in 9 minutes. So I think this is true. And when I gave my own talk the other day, what the Wernick talk, I specifically mentioned the fact is, it's amazing that, we sit back and say we're against violence, and think about what we're doing now with respect to, let's take a look at what people say when the people were canonizing Charlie Kirk. So part of the canonization of Charlie Kirk is he's someone who was willing to debate anyone. Okay, so he did not believe in censorship. He did not believe in cancel culture. Supposedly, this is part of the canonization of him, and he's someone that always welcomed debate. What's the response to, if you want to honor somebody? I think the best way of honoring somebody is trying to live up to the principles that made you respect that person so much. So what is the response? What are we seeing as a response to this tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk? We see cancel culture, maybe worse than we saw previously on the Democrats, which was also horrible. But so now anyone who has a bad word to say about Charlie Kirk, they want to take away their passport, their job, their bank account, who knows what they want to do, and see them fired so that I guess they basically want people to basically become homeless and then be exterminated once they become homeless, because you've taken away any ability for them to earn any money because they thought that Charlie Kirk deserved what he got. And of course, that's a horrible thing, but he's not the first person who was a public figure who got assassinated where people thought he got what he deserved.
Left and right. Yeah.
So it's not like nobody else has said. A lot of people were laughing when Ruth Bader Ginsburg got killed. Now many conservatives saying now we can put the conservative on the court. They were happy, when she died. People celebrated McCain's death because he was an obstacle for Trump. So he's not the first public figure that ever got ridiculed. His death got ridiculed.
I'd like to weigh in briefly before I have to leave, and that is, I want to go back to you. You said something right at the beginning, Jeffrey, about the language that Washington used. If we go back further and further into history, because it's this idea that we're modern and we know more than anybody else that ever lived is put to a test every moment of our lives. But there was a Latin phrase. I think it was it derived from the philosopher of Sparta by the name of Chilon, and the phrase was "De mortuis nil nisi bonum," which translates to "of the dead, say nothing but good." And there is some wisdom in that. Not that we don't have our own opinions about people after they pass, but there is some wisdom to that kind of thinking, because it enables us to be free of whatever the condition was of that person and what they caused, and to create a new condition based on our own values. And I just think that that the backlash that we're seeing right now to the events that included and followed the killing of Charlie Kirk is a testimony about how, again, we're losing our way, and he's gone. Let him be. We can have our own opinions, but those who want to reframe his life for their own justification, I don't buy it. I mean, I think there is some deeper truth about, don't speak ill of the dead. Now, in history, somebody's going to come up with the Hitlers and the other examples who you have to look and say, yeah, they were bad, very bad, evil. But we've got to be careful about cycling and recycling and fixating.
Dennis, I think here we've been very careful to not say anything ill of Kirk. So,
I would just say, Dennis, what do you say?
let me
What do
finish
you-
the point I was going to make.
Yeah.
Bruce.
Yeah.
Back to that's his comments. But the
I
point
said-
is now, what is our response as a society now with respect to Gaza? We now want to terminate people who now speak about the rights of Palestinians, the rights of Gazans, or who believe, as I believe, that Israel is committing genocide. They're now threatening to take away citizens' passports. They're now threatening to deport. They're looking through the permit for anyone who makes these comments that this. So they want to shut down any conversation about, So this is the way of honoring, this guy who apparently was willing to freely debate almost anyone. To honor, and they say a paragon of free speech. And again, I'm not condemning him. I'm now talking about the people who say they want to honor him. And the response is they're silent on this genocide. And not only are they silent on the genocide, they want to impose silence on everyone else.
Can I jump in?
Not only do that, they're giving weapons. I got a lawsuit against Marco Rubio because we're weaponizing the Israelis to commit the genocide.
Can I jump in really quickly before Dennis leaves?
Laws that Dennis passed saying that's not what he's supposed to do. But to give some balance here, remember the famous Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. The evil men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. That's an element too. It doesn't mean you have to say something negative about people who died, but they may provide a lesson that you want to correct. I don't think we should be blind to reality. Right. And of course, and those who are trying to, condemn Julius Caesar, they ended up creating a civil war and they backed Emperor Augustus to where they began with Julius Caesar. Anyway, it's like, I think, Dennis, the point is that we need to strive for the Aristotelian mean for everything. Any idea, any principle taken too far then becomes counterproductive. But you have to have a critical mind to know where to draw the line. Right. And we don't train anybody. They don't know how to draw lines anymore. It's all one way or the other. It's like George W. Bush after 9/11. You're for us or against us. There's no middle ground. There's like a million middle grounds. What do you mean you're either for us or against us? That's an absurd position to take.
That's where we are now. Right. And that's why it has to err on the side of the principle, in my opinion, because you don't have any other guiding force. Before we go into that, though, before Dennis leaves in a minute, I just want to add to his point about, I think what we're getting at, and I really appreciate, is there's logic to the idea of putting it behind us, as opposed, and like not trying to find negativity, but honesty. I would agree with Bruce is very important in this conversation, that we need to be able to honestly discuss these things and not go after someone, for petty reasons. But can we discuss about how he had an opinion about something that I find offensive? Of course we can. That's not insulting. That's just us engaging with the opinion. But what Dennis's point is, we should strive for that. But when information comes out that's misinforming about that, I feel like we have a duty to counteract that with the truth. But it has to be, amicable. But go ahead, Dennis. Since you're leave, I'll give you.
Ryan, that's a very good point, and I want to thank all of you for giving me an opportunity for being able to participate, and I look forward to joining with all of you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah. So I'd love to bring this into that larger view. I was hoping to get his thoughts on it too, but when you push the envelope, because all of these conversations are swirling around the same thing, and what this is putting it to the test right now is where we stand on that principle, right? So they're saying we can't, these people are saying bad things. Go ahead.
Let's think about the limits of it. We now want to tell people Palestinians have a right to statehood. They have a right to be treated with respect, like every other individual have. And people can make a good faith argument that I certainly accept that the people in Gaza are being victims of genocide.
Absolutely.
So apparently supporting genocide is acceptable, but being against celebrating the extermination of tens of thousands of people is okay. Okay. Not only is it okay, if you take the contrary position, you're going to suffer damages. But then celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk is evil. I mean, so the question is, how do people define good and evil? I mean, so I'm not sitting. I don't want to sit back and say that I'm condoning anyone who says that, who basically celebrates the death of any person. I think they're disgusting anyone who celebrates the death of any people.
Agreed.
But any of the people who are offended by the death of the assassination of Charlie Kirk celebrate the assassination of a whole bunch of other people every day of the week. Okay, we drone innocent people, we blow people out of the water who are innocents, and they celebrate this stuff. So it's not like people are against assassinating. They're against assassinating people they want to see assassinated. They're not against the violence. They just want to see the violence applied to people they want to see it applied against. It's not necessarily rejection of violence. They embrace violence, okay?
Yeah. Jeffrey, that is absolutely true. Unfortunately, it's been true from the beginning of time.
Right.
So, and I think it's useful again to reflect. This goes back thousands of years because there's nothing new under the sun. Thucydides recounts in his history of the Peloponnesian War. The Athenian Empire is fighting Sparta. They want the island of Melos to either pay tribute or join them as an ally against Sparta. The Melians say, no, we don't want to do that. We just want to be neutral. We're appealing to your sense of justice. We haven't been engaged one way or the other in favor against Sparta. And this is what the Athenians respond. They say, don't give us this crap about justice. They say, listen, it's built into the human species, domination, control, killing for the sake of power. And they say to themselves, listen, if you were in our shoes, you would do the same thing that we're doing. So don't think that you have any higher moral standing than we do, because you just don't have our power. And then they slaughtered all the Melians because they wouldn't join them in fighting against Sparta. That tale is repeated over and over and over again for tens, thousands of years. That's where we are as a species. You remember, go back to World War II, the firebombing of Tokyo. Well, that was okay. And Curtis LeMay, the head of our Air Force at the time, said, we sure better win this war because we're going to be tried as war criminals if we lose. But if we win, then we're heroes. It's a very sad commentary on the species, but you hit the nail on the head, Jeffrey. That's what we are. It's okay to kill the people that we don't like. The ones that we do like, that becomes then horrible, horrible. You remember what happened again. Moses leads the Jews out of the slavery from Pharaoh. Joshua goes to the promised land. It's not unoccupied territory. He has to slaughter all the occupants. And he celebrated, Joshua is right. Hey, you brought us the promised land. Okay. It's a horrible commentary, but unfortunately we should speak against it. I don't support it, but there's nothing new about this.
Well, when you point out to say, like, so we always praised, the founding fathers conversation and the striving for something better. So I think we can all agree that there are examples like this, at least we'd like to believe, of groups trying to strive away from that, right? Like, so I think I agree with you. That is a problem we've been trying to fight. But I think what we flirt with is these moments where you could look at it this way too, that mostly power structures have been driving us there. And maybe that's not the sentiment of the species as a whole, but rather the top controlling structures. And that, momentarily throughout history, we find these times like that where the cooler heads prevail. And then eventually, because we always, if you can keep it, the Republic, we fall back into it. Right. So it's like, I just want to balance that with the idea that I think we all agree that there are people fighting for the better side of that too.
Well, they are. But remember, and the reason why we succeeded, at least at the outset, that was what separation of powers was about. If you give the war power to the executive, you'll never end war. That's why Israel will never end war, because all the powers with Netanyahu. He doesn't even when his Mossad says this is crazy to go bomb Doha, he does it anyway because he's about power. But you give it to the legislative branch, and that was what Madison's genius was. The legislative branch is a talking shop. They're not going to go to war because there's nothing in it for them. No legislator ever gets a monument built or gets history books written after him because he votes for war, right? It's all the president. And that was the success that we had for 100 years till we decided to throw away separation of powers with the Spanish-American War. And then we're in the Philippines and the lies about World War I and on and on and on. But that was, and the reason why Madison was able to succeed, because he recognized men aren't angels. If we're dealing with angels, we wouldn't need government at all. Government is a reflection of the depravity of the species, and we got to take account of that when we allocate and disperse power. We don't understand that anymore. We just be an empire. No, we don't need to check ourselves. We all have angelic DNA. We're the good guys. Everybody we attack is the bad guys. Don't question that unless you otherwise you're unpatriotic and you should be prosecuted for treason. An absurd position, but that's where we are today.
And you just made a great, comparison point, like to the Spanish War point, right? So what's the argument there? They use the threat of a whatever cataclysm problem to drive people into a position that was not consistent with their principles, or at least the nation.
Right.
We're there again today. It's the same point every single point. It's power structures manipulating the minds of people that maybe don't know any better, who have been confused about the fact, whatever, to a position where it undermines what they actually believe in. I think that speaks explicitly to the fact that it's the average people. It's back to the education point. Are just always being manipulated into the positions of the power structures. I'd like to believe that means that if without, the removal of the power structure, that people are inherently wanting good things, as altruistic.
They would, but I think your point is right in stressing the leadership. Hermann Goering, this was at the time that Hitler is rising to power in the Third Reich. He's speaking to the Reichstag and he says, so when it comes to war, he says, all governments are the same. Communist, fascist, democracies or otherwise. All you need to do to get the people to go to war is claim that you have a crisis and an emergency. And if you're not for us, you're not patriotic and a traitor. And then everybody's for it. Says It works the same everywhere. In read history, that's exactly what happens. It's the executive, and they always claim we can't give you the evidence. It's classified evidence. If you knew what we would do, that we'd be likely to be extinguished tomorrow unless we go to war. And so, and I don't certainly be the last one to tout Hermann Goering, but he's just pointing out that's a fact of government and the politics, no matter where you are. And it's the leadership, and ultimately it's the leadership. I agree with you. Human beings given proper leadership aren't going to just start killing each other. But the leadership, and part of this reason the leadership is so corrupt, is because politics attracts sociopaths. Mm-hmm. They attract people that need to be the center of attention. If you're a philosopher, what the heck do you need with politics? You're controlling your own hormonal instincts and gravitations. You want to have influence by example, not by force of arms or by money. You don't go into politics, right? Socrates didn't go into politics. He gets convicted by these sociopaths sitting on the Athenian jury. And that's the pathology that we really cannot correct without separation of powers. And we threw separation of powers out the window, 100 years ago. And we see it, every day it becomes more and more obvious.
Okay, so here we are now, right? And so we're in this position where we've been driven here, like everything we just discussed, right? And so with the knowledge that we're dealing with sociopaths, by and large, like you would argue, that's always ulterior motives. Coming back to that clear point. So we're in a position now where, and we can get back into the specific examples, Jeffrey, if we have them, about, the Charlie Kirk conversation, the idea that you have people screaming that the left is a terrorist organization, that they're a problem, or individual examples of people who are well within their constitutional rights, also disgustingly so, saying bad things about people who died. I would equally call that out. But they're now using these to argue that these people, one, should be censored, even legal action, as Jeffrey pointed out, removed from their jobs. And both sides are pointing at each other like they're the end of this country. A lot of us have been pointing this building thing out for a decade, So where do we start drawing these lines? Because like I said, I'm going the other direction. I'm saying you stand up and yell fire at a theater, people respond in their way, their actions are their responsibility. Maybe even I thought there was a fire, right? I think that's where we have to lean it into. So even with the Charlie thing, somebody comes out and says, or anybody, that I think that person should have died. Is that a crime? I agree. That's disgusting to say. Have some decorum at the least. Don't, but it is protected, so I think this is the conversation. I'm curious where you guys stand on this.
I think if the criteria is that if we're going to criminalize disgusting comments, I think the prisons, we don't have enough prison space.
Right.
But if you took everyone's disgusting comments, look at Twitter every day, or any other platform, and you'd be putting in prison about 90% of the people who participate on these platforms for the disgusting things they say. So the question is, if we try and define what is a disgusting comment, okay, when we're never going to agree on what that definition is.
Exactly.
And we might agree initially on a narrow definition, and then eventually the definition will get broader and broader and broader, and soon everybody will be in disgusting comments, and then soon nobody will be saying anything for fear of being put in prison. So yeah. I agree with you. Ultimately, we live in a society that that basically is us being responsible for our own actions. If somebody yells fire in a crowded theater. If we ran out, we got damaged and hurt, and the person knew it was a lie, then maybe we have an action against that individual. But does the state have an action against that
Yes,
person for doing
exactly.
it? I don't think the state has an action.
Right.
I don't think the state ever has an action when it comes to speech. I don't
Yeah.
think there's any speech that the state should be a party to. If somebody has been threatened, whoever feels that they've been threatened by somebody's speech, they should have an action. They should take an action, and then it's pretty decent definition of what a threat is. It means it's got to be credible and imminent, in nature. And we'll find that most people, the words people throw out there, really don't meet the legal definition of a threat.
Yeah,
So
I think to build upon what Jeffrey said and you said, Ryan, is when you get into this business of deciding what's disgusting, what's wrongful, the cure is worse than the disease.
Right.
And one of the reasons why, if not the major reason why the cure is worse than the disease, because we know government always has ulterior motives for law enforcement. I can guarantee you the words will be used to go after the political opponents, and their political supporters will get a buy. Because you have human beings that administer this stuff, right? And so you never want to give the government the power to decide, well, this is acceptable and this is not, because we know they're going to do it to warp speech, silence the opponents, and they give full megaphone, to those who support them. And that's why you want to keep the government completely out of this realm. And Jeffrey points out, you can create private causes of action for defamation or for, assault, and that kind of thing. But that's the problem. Now, and I also believe that the only way, the way that we're never going to have paradise, because the human species is made of, crooked timber, but we can get a long way towards paradise. But it's got to begin, I guess, with education. You have to revise the curriculum to inculcate critical thinking. Always ask why before how. Why does it matter? And that just doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't. And unfortunately, we've seen this in a little different sense, with regard to destroying people's lives. Now, if you say anything about the Palestinians, that's consequential. You lose your job. We said that was the anti-communist movement, the Hollywood 10. You said you had a third cousin who may have joined the Communist Party in the 1930s. That was your career, right? Ostracized, you couldn't get a job, nothing. And that persisted for decades. It wasn't just Joe McCarthy. And that, again, came about because of the threat inflation. The communists are going to take us over tomorrow, even though the FBI had more secret crypto members of the Communist Party of USA than their actual members were. But that, again, goes to the threat inflation in order to get the government to frighten us to surrender our liberties. But if we don't get back on the educational mission, I don't see how this can be corrected. Because we need to make the politicians, the leaders, think if you don't do the right thing, you're out of office. Because that's all they care about is power. But and it can happen. I did happen at one time. When we had a more educated public, even if they had fewer, curriculum documents on the wall saying where they graduated and got degrees, but they actually read and thought, spent their time thinking about serious subjects, which doesn't happen anymore. But that's so and part of the process I view, Jeffrey and Ryan, that's what we're engaged in right now.
That's what I was going to say.
Education, that we're trying in our best way, and we're not infallible, but we're trying to get them to think about these issues, and be suspicious of government for good reason, because we see all the consequences when you give them limitless power.
Yeah, I government and speech and things like that. I saw today, I guess it was yesterday, some person, I don't know why they made a reference now to Parler, Parler, the platform that I was involved in during 2020. And Bruce, you were there.
Yep.
We experienced that together. And apparently this person, I guess Paul Joseph Watson, did some sort of tweet on it, and then Elon Musk retweeted it, and so it got millions of views and apparently sympathetic views to Paula. All people who were silent in 2020 and ran away from Paula when Paula was controversial.
Right.
But the reason why I bring this up is that during my involvement in Paula, I was very outspoken against Section 230. that previously, as you're probably aware of, there was the CompuServe ruling, and the CompuServe ruling basically said if you host basically a public bulletin board, and basically have it as just a bulletin board where people could put any content up, you don't have an obligation to surveil what people put up. And as long as you don't have any rules other than here's a board for people to put up the content they have, the only people liable for the content put up is the person who puts up the content in case that content damages somebody else. And that's only through a private action between the person who thinks they've been wronged by that content and wronged in a way that they think they have a legal claim. So from the way I had wanted Parler to basically be a bulletin board, and the conversation came up with the chief policy officer who was not as absolutist on free speech as me, nor the founder, I don't think was as absolutist on free speech as me, given the conversations we had about the guidelines. And I remember, some of the content that was being put on, prior to January 6th, that fateful day in 2021, January 6th. And some people were putting horrible content up. On the most part, when the chief policy officer came to me, I said, I don't want to see the content because I don't want to have knowledge. I don't want to have knowledge I'm not obligated to have knowledge of, because then there's only downside for me. There's no upside. I'm not going to make any money off the knowledge, but I might have an obligation I don't want to feel obligated to. So I'd rather not know something that there's no reason for me to know. So, that's for society to judge. We're a public utility in the sense that people put content up, and I'll read what I want to read, and I don't want to read what I don't want to read, and everybody else has the same right. So ultimately, the chief policy officer said, what should I do about this? I said, well, if you think it's terrible, use your criteria, and if you think it's against the guidelines, do what you think. And then she said to me, well, I'm going to go to the FBI, and I just said, use your judgment and do what you want to do. Just don't talk to me. So, which is what I then, in my mind, it was Ryan and I was starting to talk about it. And I was kind of think, why is she even reading this stuff? I mean, why does she want to have knowledge of it? Okay. I didn't want to have knowledge of any of this stuff because I wanted to keep to the principles of what would make us, the platform itself as a host, immune from liability. Now, immunity from liability, according to common law jurisprudence, was you put up a bulletin board, you have no obligation or duty to surveil. The people who do the surveillance or the other people are the people who are reading at the platform. And if they think somebody posted content and they know who posted it and they think they have an action against the person who posted content, it's between those parties. We're just providing infrastructure for people to communicate. So, and basically what happened in the destruction of Parler was the ability to create a bulletin board that operates consistent with those common law jurisprudence precedent was destroyed.
Right.
And think about, in my opinion, I'll tell you why I think it was destroyed. Okay. I think it was destroyed is what's the attractiveness of the unattractiveness to government to my philosophy of how these platforms should operate. If I'm not doing any surveillance, okay, then the government can't come to me for asking me any questions. It can't get access to information, and advertisers can't promote and do ads on it or any of the stuff like that because they can't cherry pick data and stuff like that. So if I think about how horrible it would be for government if platforms scaled that didn't do any surveillance. Okay.
Well, add to that, Jeffrey. I think
Snowden had already said that these other so-called companies are not social media companies, they're surveillance companies masquerading as social media companies. So my argument would be the only true social media company at that point in time was Parler and BitChute.
Interesting. I'm going to think about that. That's a really interesting point. So it becomes a surveillance company fronting as social media if it begins to surveil at this primary. I would even argue primary means of revenue too, the data they sell, right? But I think I would add to your point that I think that was done by design. And tell me if you agree with that. Like they create not just that they can surveil what you now see, but then they create like as a public facing argument that you knew and did nothing, as opposed to being unaware and not surveilling. It's a hard sell to get people to say he should have been surveilling them. But when they say you saw these things and did nothing, that many innocent people are going to be like, well, he should have done something about it, like the moral argument. So I think it's about creating the reality around it that it's easily sold to the average person for why it makes sense to undermine their constitutional rights.
But I think, I mean, the model is the telephone. Nobody believes a telephone company is liable because somebody uses a telephone,
Right.
plots a murder, plots a conspiracy or something. The phone is just there. There's nothing different. That the model that Parler was using was the model of phone company that had been around for over hundreds of years.
The principle.
And why that wasn't accepted were the ulterior motives that the politicians have. And the phones, well, that was then. Now. And part of it is because I think that the lust for power since the United States has grown so much stronger, and that government is so much bigger. They make greater demands and encroach on our liberty more than was true when the phones and Alexander Bell makes his invention at the time that still liberty was the glory of the country, right? He didn't worry about government imposed liabilities or sanctions. AT&T growing up in 1900s. Today, no, anything that moves, it'll get gravitated and absorbed by the military industrial complex, which is going to happen with AI. There's not a shadow of a doubt.
I think it started that way, Bruce.
AI is going to be conscripted.
I think it started that way, quite frankly. I think it was designed with that early on mindset. But I have to actually break off in about 8 minutes. I have another appointment, but I wanted to add that, to the larger point. I think that we didn't focus enough on the state versus personal point that Jeffrey was saying. I think that is the crux of the conversation, that, it's conflating the things, right? To where, yes, there are people out there saying things that you might find offensive, even with the word, regardless of my opinion, may be illegal today. And the argument is that from a personal perspective, somebody can choose to sue them based on that reality. But when the state begins using these things to deport people or to get, any number of the other actions we discussed, that's the big issue we should be discussing, because that's the divide.
Ryan, this is mob behavior. Because what basically people saying is, I don't have an action against this person, but I don't like it. Okay, so I want to lobby somebody else to go after this person because I really don't have an action that I can do against this person. I just don't like this person. I don't want to see them exist. So I want to see them behind bars. I want to see them dead. I don't want to see them exist. But there's nothing I could do about it. But if me and enough other people don't like this person, we can act as a mob to convince the government to go after these people. This is why we should, as Bruce and I guess we all believe, is that we should really rely upon private actions against parties, and the government should stay out of all this stuff.
Exactly.
Okay? The government should stay out of all this stuff. If we have a private action, if somebody causes harm to us, then we use the legal system to go after them. But the government should not be going after anyone. It should be because the government is never the damaged party in any of these things. So private people are the damaged parties, and the private parties should be people that should be able to take action against them, not the government. The government is not a damaged party in almost every stuff, and we shouldn't give the government this power. Because this is what creates the government to tyrannize people. Right. Is this proliferation? Of look. It used to be. Thought before we got civilized, that people thought, whether you were, a Jew, a Muslim, or a Christian, that more or less the 10 Commandments was pretty good. Okay, and you don't really need much more than the 10 Commandments. Well, you could use even few. There was the Noahide law, because you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to. So you could just basically say, I don't covet what's not mine. I'm going to respect my parents. I'm not going to covet what's not mine. I'm not going to commit adultery, and I'm not going to murder. And people said, okay, that seems to be more than enough of what we need. That if it's not ours, we don't have a right to it. It's pretty simple. That's called property rights. So, that's all we need to do is for people to basically have the ability to go to courts to enforce their property rights. And as Madison said, we have rights in our property and property in our rights. So we should just take private actions. The government should have, and the inalienable rights was basically the point that the government can't take away this stuff, nor can anyone else. And if somebody else takes it away from us, we take them to court. But the government should never be a party to any of this stuff. So, but I want to add one other thing, Ryan, before you leave, because you have the video. Going back to, and this is kind of changing the topic, but I want to get to one of the. We have another example of more what it seems to be a government lie. We had an example where we got information that and I want to give some context to this, and then you show the video that we had an illegal immigrant who apparently was stopped. It seems like it was probably profiling, just looking at people, looking at the cars, and looking for somebody who looks Latino and stopping them and then asking them, show me your papers. And the description we got is this person got the illegal got shot out of self-defense, because the description we got is the illegal got in the car, tried to run over the law enforcement person, and then was dragging the law enforcement person. So in an act of desperate self-defense, they shot this person. I also want to give one other little comment before this. I can understand this person's reaction. I mean, it's illegal, so I don't want to say it's illegal, but it's some understandable. It seems like this person has lived in the U.S. for 19 years. That's what I think. So this person has so far, from what I've read, never been guilty of committing a crime, just had a traffic infraction, committed no other crime. And he's not being stopped. He's not being stopped to where the consequences of the stop is he gets a ticket. The consequence of the stop is his whole life is destroyed. His whole family gets uprooted. His whole life, 19 years. I mean, his roots are here. Okay. So, if you sit back and say, holy stuff, everything I built here is going to be destroyed. I mean, again, I don't want to sit back and say what he did is legal. Okay. But what invites this type of behavior is we're basically applying a form of capital punishment on these people for these type of acts. You had a guy who's lived here 19 years, and this counts for nothing. Usually when you have a judgment in a court of law, a judge will say, well, there's mitigating circumstances, so, I have some flexibility in sentences. Here we have a system that says basically, we don't care about any mitigating circumstances. We want to apply the maximum penalty to everyone who's guilty. Okay, we don't care if they're mitigating circumstances or not. We're going to apply the maximum penalty. And that's actually making us less safe. If he knew that maybe all he would get was a fine or something like that, something like that, he probably then would have driven away, would have accepted the consequences of the fact. But this is his life being taken away. Life being away for doing something that's a civil infraction. Okay? Crossing the border, undocumented, that's a civil infraction. And since then, he's only had a traffic infraction. And we want to just deport people who have built a life here. This is not like he was here a week ago. 19 years, paid taxes, probably worked, all this type, been a contributor to society. We really have to think about the fact is, I'm not saying all these illegal immigrants should be some recourse for their coming in improperly, but I don't want to see their lives destroyed. How inhumane is that? So
I think, Jeffrey, what you've described here, I mean, in terms, at least the spirit is captured in the Constitution that prohibits excessive fines, excessive civil fines. And this is beyond the criminal. And what you've described basically is a de facto fine, totally disproportionate to any conception of the wrongdoing that was done. And we need, and this is an example where I think that when you read the understanding or purpose behind the Constitution without being too literal, it should be applied to address precisely the situations that you've described. This is just overkill. You can have you need to have a sanctions that's commensurate with the nature of the wrongdoing in the individual. And this is so disproportionate. It's an excessive fine that ought to be held unconstitutional.
Well, let's watch it. And then I have a comment on a case that we actually talked about from last week, and then I have to bounce.
Surveillance video from this morning shows two ICE agents conducting a vehicle stop. The agents surround the silver car. The driver reverses the vehicle. The officer on the passenger side can be seen pointing his weapon as the driver attempts to flee the scene. As the car drives away, the agent on the driver's side can no longer be seen in this video. In a different surveillance video, two gunshots can be heard as the vehicle drives away. In a statement, DHS said the driver, Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, struck one of the officers and dragged them as he drove away. That officer then fired his weapon, hitting Villegas Gonzalez. Social media video shows Villegas Gonzalez laying on the ground bleeding as agents appeared to provide immediate care.
We don't want our communities to be in this fear continuously.
The shooting sparked outrage among immigration advocates and local leaders.
It is wrong, it is unconstitutional, and it is straight up racism.
A DHS spokesperson said the ICE agent followed his training, used appropriate force, and properly enforced the law to protect the public and law enforcement. The officer sustained multiple injuries and is now in stable condition. Villegas Gonzalez was pronounced dead at the hospital. According to ICE, he entered the U.S. illegally and had a history of traffic violations. ICE presence in the community created tension between protesters and agents outside of a migrant processing center near Chicago. Earlier today, we were with ICE agents as they attempted to carry out arrest. They were led by Marcus Charles, the head of the agency's deportation branch. How long can we expect the operation to last here in Chicago?
I'm not going to go into time. We're going to do what we need to do to get as many of these criminal illegal aliens off the streets and to protect the public.
Tensions are running high here over President Trump's escalating crackdown on illegal immigration. Internal data obtained by CBS News shows ICE this week surpassed 200,000 arrests since the president took office.
Camila Montoya Galvez, thank you.
Well, I'll jump right in. So if the person was illegally in this country, it's important in general to point out that's a crime, right? And yes, there should be, accountability for the crimes in place. And obviously with, having some human nature of understanding. But the idea that you're getting at the beginning is that we're talking about somebody who is being dealt with in that regard. Again, 19 years, which does make a difference to me in the reality of lack of criminality other than a traffic stop. So to deal with it with that level of action in the first place, I do think is a little bit over the top. But so one, was it somebody who was profiled? That matters to me. So, but if they were going after him because they had him listed, they identified him, they went up to him, you have to acknowledge that if the guys, one, identified themselves, which very much matters to me, and then did, say, here's what we're arresting you for, here's the charge, here's who we are. Without any of that, you could easily argue with the way the world is today that you don't know for sure those are people just dressing up and trying to rob you. As we all talked about, I've seen endless examples of that. Women being raped, stores being robbed as people dress up like ICE or police and then carry out these actions because today they're being told they don't have to identify themselves. But all that aside, understanding all the nuanced points of this, I think matters because clearly as he drove away, somebody did get hurt. And that does have to kind of matter in the conversation. But I think I want to understand all the nuance to get the specifics. But I think the core point is that what they're doing is over the top. They're not identifying themselves. They're not acting within the Constitution and then acting irrationally after that. And I want to go back to the point from the story we talked about the other day, which I think really makes it all the more clear. Remember, we talked about the family who did get profiled. This has now been proven, who they swarm up around the car. They rounded around the car and they said, get out of your car. And they simply said, what's going on? What's going on? Why am I being arrested? Who are you? They bashed the window in. The guy took off because he didn't know what was happening with the same reasoning we just pointed out. Then they opened fire on the car. Remember this? It was like 3 or 4 shots, whole family in the car. He drove home. He went inside, called the police and said, I don't know what just happened, but I'm the victim here. They surrounded his car, the FBI, ICE, everybody. And they surrounded the house rather. They waited on the house. They eventually got him to come out. They had him in custody and they let him go, claiming sanctuary city, which makes no sense with even the reality of the circumstance. Or if they claim, which they did, that he ran over an officer and that's why they opened fire. We're to believe they would let that person go because of a point that makes no relevance in that. So long story short, it came around that they went to court. They were forced to acknowledge that nobody was actually injured. That came out publicly. Then they went back and arrested him. As far as I can tell, he's still in jail. What a perfect example of where we are in this country, where not only is it proven to have acted within the law because they didn't identify themselves, they didn't give a warrant, all of this. And then they opened fire on the family, lying that they were injured, proved they weren't, and they still put him in jail. And he wasn't even an illegal immigrant. They put him in jail because of the injury they claimed. This is crazy to me.
Let me add something to that, Ryan, to your comments.
Okay.
If the police, the law enforcement, the ICE, whoever, successfully killed everybody in the car,
right, and
posted that video and everybody was killed, I bet you there'd be many people on Twitter celebrating those people getting killed. Okay.
Fair point.
And nobody would be losing their job over celebrating those people being killed. And that would be an assassination. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. I do have to break off, but I think these conversations increasingly become more relevant and more important, guys. So thank you for continuing to do this. And I'm looking forward to doing it next week.
Yeah. And just as a final point here on the Constitution, the Supreme Court has made it clear that you cannot kill somebody, accused even of a felony, who is fleeing, unless their flight creates an imminent danger, to another, right? an imminent danger. That's under the Constitution. These violations occur every single day. There's no remedy. There's no disincentive. I come back. Institutionally, why not? There's nothing's going to happen to me, even if I flout the Constitution. If I were in Congress, one of the first things I would do is introduce a bill saying that there is a private right of action to sue any government official who has violated my constitutional rights. Unfortunately, that's not the situation right now. They got these defenses, good faith defense, immunities, whatever. I would throw all of that away. Understanding, like Brandeis, government is the potent and omnipresent teacher. It teaches by example. When government becomes a lawbreaker, it invites every man and woman to become a law unto themselves. Anarchy. The strictness
with the word
of
anarchy.
Compliance should be greater. Right? This is the oddity. You have more leeway to flout the Constitution if you're a government official than if you're not. You have more leeway if you have an oath of office to uphold the Constitution than if you're not. That makes no sense whatsoever.
One thought, and I have to go. I recommend people take the moment to actually look up the definition of anarchy, and I think it's interesting. And I understand the sentiment, but we have long been misled and deliberately confused on the word and what it means. It means no rulers, not no rules. And I think it's very important to understand. But nonetheless, I'll leave you with this, Bruce. Rather anarchy than tyranny.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, Bruce, I have some questions. We have some questions this week, so
Okay.
I like to encourage questions. So I'm going to go with you all the questions that have been submitted here for me to read to you. One person wrote, fire in a theater is not a legal standard. The legal standard is Ohio versus Brandenburg. The phrase is often misunderstood as an absolute legal limit on speech, but late rulings set more precise standards based on intent and likelihood of harm. So yelling fire isn't inherently illegal.
Well, in context, he's right. He's referring to the case called Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, where the court said that even encouraging or advocating law violation is protected speech unless the speaker intends to create imminent lawless violence and is likely to succeed. So Brandenburg is the controlling test. Now, the Supreme Court may reject that at some time. It's a different court than 1969. William Brennan wrote the opinion at that time, but the questioner clearly knows what he's talking about in the constitutional sense.
Okay, good. Then another. This is one of a statement from somebody else. My problem is that several powerful Democrats have been calling for violence against President Trump and conservatives, and there have never been any arrests or lawsuits over it. Now, my understanding, when there's somebody who threatens any president, that the FBI pretty quickly shows up at their house if it's considered a one that meets the standard of being a
true threat. Right. That's correct. And I think there have been some investigations, and not only criminal, but it's on the civil side that you can sue for assault if somebody makes a threat that puts you in imminent fear that there'll be an unconsented touching. Now, I think that the U.S. Supreme Court has held that if you're going to punish threat, there has to be some subjective appreciation on the speaker that what was being said would be interpreted by the target as being a threat and put them in fear of their life or physical harm. They're called the Counterman versus Colorado. But listen, I'm against threatening anybody with violence. We have a peaceful country. We have avenues of redress. Violence is not one of them, except in self-defense. You have a right to preserve your own life. Somebody's threatening you, you can respond. But it's wrong for Republicans or Democrats or atheists or believers or anyone, to advocate or threaten others with violence. We are a country where we use words, persuasion to try to obtain differences of opinion. And we have a ballot box that we use provisionally to decide questions that we disagree about. But violence, except in self-defense, is always a cure worse than the disease.
Here, example again. The government is a terrible example and role model for that principle. Is because the fact is we kill a lot of people when there's no imminent direct threat to us.
Yeah.
So the government should not be able to do anything that an individual could not get away with doing.
Yeah.
So if I can only kill somebody in an act of self-defense, in what would be described as self-defense and meet the conditions of being described as self-defense, where the threat was imminent and direct to me. So and I had no other choice, or that person has no other choice. Outside of that, there's never an excuse for violence, and that should apply to nations as much as it applies to individuals. There's no reason why a country should be able to collectively get away with something an individual singularly could not get away with.
Yeah.
So, and we have a country that celebrates violence.
Yeah.
So
I call that, Jeffrey, I call war, the true definition of war is legalizing what in peacetime is first-degree murder. That's what war is.
Yeah.
It legalizes what in peacetime is first-degree murder.
And you probably remember that famous, probably not to many people it's famous, but the debate that they had at the Ronald Reagan Library, something like that, the presidential debate that Ron Paul appeared on, and when he talked about peace and the golden rule, he got booed by the audience. Yeah. So that gives an indication of we have to really give some thought on why we think as a principle that we would apply to ourselves as individuals and think it's the appropriate principles as an individual somehow would not apply to us collectively as a government. Because what is a country? It's a collective of the people that comprise that country. Right. So the same standards, because you scale the problem, doesn't mean that there's furthermore justification. If there's not a threat, we shouldn't be causing harm to anybody unless there's a direct imminent threat to us. As an individual or as a country. Outside of that, Iran was no threat to us. This boat certainly was no threat to us. So none of these things are threats to us. Yet we go in there and we kill a lot of people. The domino theory, yes, we always have this explanation that if you don't do this, the next day you'll be speaking Japanese or Chinese or Arabic, or some other language other than English, and that's the fear that always the government instills. Here's another question. This is the final question. Someone believes, I think many people believe this. Actually, our friend, more your friend than mine, but someone I respect, Thomas Massey, also believes this. AIPAC needs to be declared a foreign lobbyist group.
Yes, there's no doubt that this goes again to the fact that law enforcement is always politicized. AIPAC clearly is a foreign agent on behalf of the state of Israel and needs to register as a foreign agent, for sure. Jim Bamford has written books about this. The reason why they're not forced to register, because they got political influence on both the Democratic and Republican side. So the government never takes any action to force them to register. They're every bit as much, an advocate for Israel and takes orders directly or indirectly, like Sputnik or Russian TV, RT, or the Chinese broadcast media, they have to register as foreign agents. AIPAC falls into this. It doesn't mean that AIPAC is illegal. It just means that they have to disclose that they're really acting as a voice for the state of Israel. But that would, diminish their clout in the United States and make perhaps politicians less likely to take campaign contributions. But surely the question is correct. And if you don't believe that, read Mearsheimer and Walt's book called The Israeli Lobby.
Are there other groups that you think also that right now don't have foreign lobbyist status that probably should be declared as representatives of foreign agents?
Well, I think, Jeffrey, if you applied the law even-handedly, the BBC, all of these government-supported outlets, and you have the BBC and the Falkland Islands, they were an echo chamber of Margaret Thatcher. If you applied the law even-handedly, and I don't think the law is a great one, but if it's going to be enforced, it should be even-handedly. Yeah, all government-owned outlets, broadcasters, should be registered as foreign agents, because we know the government run. I've never met a politician in my whole life, and I'm pretty old, maybe older than people think, that didn't have ulterior motives. That's the definition of a politician, right? You got ulterior political motive behind everything. If you run a broadcaster or a media outlet, of course they're going to reflect your views. That's the nature of the beast. And they would be all these broadcasters would be registered as foreign agents.
What if you have a circumstance, which I'm sure, which I guess would go on? Let's say you have a situation where you have, like in the case of Mexico now, we have new negotiations regarding the free trade agreement. There are certain countries that have made significant investment in Mexico, and then and then the Mexican president goes to the CEOs of these companies and say, you've got significant investments here. This is bad for you and bad for us. Go and lobby the president on why this is important to you. Okay. So the question is, where's the boundary of the company doing what's in its best interest to preserve the status quo, as opposed to them also basically representing the interests of the company, because that country is telling them that they should and I'm sure this happens with the US. I'm sure the US companies that go and have the American government support to represent American national interest and that company's interest in a country. And I would assume that action probably does not involve us registering as foreign agents, when probably these companies are representing their own personal interests, but also understand that they're representing the country's interest, because they might get some benefit by having the government request that they do something. So where do you set the boundary of when somebody thinks it's in their self-interest, but also they are collaborating with another country because they each have their interests aligned? So
the statute provides the best answer, and it's pretty broad. I think it may be unconstitutional. It says that if you act at the request or behest of a foreign government or foreign official, you don't have to have a contract. If they call you up and say, we think it's a good idea, and you respond, you have to register a foreign agent. It doesn't mean that you have to actually have any business deal or commitment. If the foreign government asks you and you respond, you're supposed to register. Now, it's a murky area in the law, is what is a request or not. And that's why you were reluctant to have too many laws, because we know that the Foreign Agents Registration Act is administered for political purposes. That's why RT is there and the Chinese there, the BBC is not there, and other government outlets are not, because it's a political calculation. It's not whether they fall within the statute, but the statute is very broad. If you at the request or behest of a foreign official.
So now let me ask you a follow-up question to this. Who would have standing to bring up, if somebody should be registered as a foreign agent that hasn't, okay, and the government is letting people get away, who would say, I'm a damaged party for the government not doing this, and I could bring a case that should challenge the lack of having standards? So a lot of people believe AIPAC should be represented as Thomas Massey does. So outside of Congress doing something, is there anyone else who could I don't know who could claim that they're being damaged, in a way that the court would give them standing in a case?
No, well, you're exactly right. And this is a situation, and there are many similar ones, Jeffrey, where there is no, other than Congress, there is no independent party who has standing to claim X, Y, or Z ought to be registered as a foreign agent. Doesn't satisfy certainly the Article 3 case or controversy standards of the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's either the voters vote officials out of office because they're not enforcing the law, or Congress impeaches them and removes them because they're not enforcing the law. But there is no private cause of action, and this is not unique. You could have unconstitutional. Let's take this another situation, Jeffrey. We know that the president has approached a couple of companies who export chips to China. And he said, okay, despite the fact that the Constitution forbids any export taxes, it says, you got to kick in 15% of any revenue you get on China if you want export. Well, who has standing? If they're going to do it because they figure exporting is better than nothing at all, because Trump could have a complete embargo for everybody, sending any chips to China. So are you and me going to have authority to challenge an export tax? We're not paying the tax. And the answer is no. So there are many, many cases like this. Suppose the president issues an unconstitutional take an example where a bribe is paid to the president to pardon someone. Who has standing to challenge that? I mean, Congress may impeach. You don't have, are you going to claim, I can claim, what's my direct injury because of the improper pardon? Other than, well, you're flouting the obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So you've hit upon a very good point, which keeps underscoring that what I repeat is, if Congress is going to renounce and surrender the impeachment power, huge swaths of the United States Constitution are going to go unenforced because we don't have private individuals with injury to take the case to an Article III court.
And then what do we think is more damage to our republic? Someone undocumented who never really committed any sort of crime besides crossing the border undocumented, or the Israeli influence over our country? Which do you think is more dangerous for our country?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's a no-brainer. We get involved with, bombing Iran, inviting blowback, getting involved in creating genocide examples, ethnic cleansing that's going to come back to haunt us in the United States, creating us an object of vilification in many other countries. So that's a much far, in the long run for sure, maybe even the short run, danger than, an immigrant who here is unlawfully and is complying with the law.
Yeah, because Trump has made some comments where it would be a reasonable inference from the comments he made that he bombed Iran just as a favor to Bibi. I mean, so that he did for Israel's interest, not for our interest. Only they're good buddies. So, you want me you couldn't finish the job yourself. So you want me to come and finish what you couldn't get done yourself. Okay. I'm happy to do a favor for you. So
we become the mercenaries of Israel, like the Hessians and the British during the Revolutionary War. It's really quite disgusting. Listen, I don't fault Israel for putting its interests ahead of all countries purportedly put their interests ahead of other countries. That's the nature. But the United States, why are we subordinating ourselves, to another country's interests? Israel will sell, and I don't fault, Israel will sell and weapons to any other country it feels that it's in the interest of Israel. Of course they're going to do that. They don't have first loyalties to the United States. Jonathan Pollard, with loyalty with Israel, not the United States, and they don't have any trouble spying on us. They didn't have any trouble stealing uranium from us to build nuclear weapons. They don't have any trouble lying to us about their nuclear facilities. Of course, they're protecting themselves. So what's new? What's new is that, wait a minute, we don't defend our own interests. We put ourselves second. Where are these American firsters out there, right? Except when it comes to Israel. Then we're not only second place, we're like third place.
So what would be your concluding words for today, Bruce? And thank you again.
Yeah. Anyway, the concluding words always never get discouraged. Even if, we look like it's very, very bleak in persuading others of the current generation to turn things around. Even if we're speaking to an audience that's not born yet, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, we need to say we need to do the right thing and continue the struggle any event. We don't know who's going to come along and pick up the baton. And I always go back to this story. The very first person who denounced slavery, the first person who denounced treating women as chattels, we don't know who they were. It didn't happen overnight that there were any reforms, but the conversation had to begin somewhere. If not us, who? If not now, when?
Thank you so much, Bruce. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.